My name is Evelyn Hart, and for most of my life, I was the quiet one. The girl who listened more than she spoke, who carried secrets heavier than anyone could see. He told me to stay silent, to bury the truth deep enough that no one would ever find it. But silence isn't peace, it's pressure, waiting to explode. And when the reporter turned to me, microphone in hand, and asked the very first question, I realized this was my moment. The world was finally listening, and I was done being quiet. They say silence is golden, but for me, it was a cage made of glass. You could see through it, but you couldn't escape. My name is Evelyn Hart, and for years, my world revolved around a man who mastered control not through violence, but through words sharpened with quiet cruelty. He didn't have to shout to make me feel small. He only had to remind me, in his calm, condescending tone, that my voice didn't matter. "Stay quiet, Evelyn," he'd whisper whenever I dared to speak up. "You don't understand how the world works." And maybe, for a while, I believed him. It started subtly, him speaking for me in meetings, correcting me in front of others, pretending it was to help me grow. At first, I mistook it for mentorship, but soon I realized it was a silencing tactic. Every idea I shared became his, every success, his achievement, and every failure, mine. I watched as my own hard work was presented under his name while I stood in the background, smiling like the good little assistant he trained me to be. The worst part? I thought that was normal. At night, I'd sit in my small apartment staring at the city lights outside my window. The world looked so alive, so free, yet I felt trapped behind invisible walls. I'd replay his words in my head until they started sounding like my own thoughts. "You're not ready. You talk too much. No one listens to you." Over time, I didn't need him to silence me. I did it myself. That's the most dangerous kind of control, the kind that makes you mute your own soul. But deep inside, something in me refused to die. Every injustice he covered up, every truth he buried, it carved itself into me. Not as pain, but as purpose. I started keeping notes, small details, hidden documents, things I wasn't supposed to see but couldn't unsee. I told myself it was just insurance, just in case. But part of me knew I was building something, quietly, carefully, a voice waiting to be unleashed. Then came the day everything changed. We were attending a public conference. He was the keynote speaker, the visionary leader everyone admired. Cameras flashed, journalists lined the stage, and I stood backstage holding his notes like I always did. He looked at me before walking up to the podium, that same patronizing smile on his face. "Remember, stay quiet. You don't need to say a word." But fate had other plans. When the speech ended, the reporter turned, not to him, but to me. "Miss Hart, you were part of the project too, weren't you? Would you like to share your perspective?" Time froze. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it echoing in my ears. He shot me a warning glance, the kind that once made me shrink. But not this time. For the first time in years, I took a breath, not to hold it, but to release it. And as I opened my mouth to speak, I felt the glass walls around me finally begin to crack. That was the moment silence lost its power. The words that left my mouth that day were small, careful, almost trembling, but they were mine. For years, I had been trained to measure every syllable, to second-guess every thought. But as the first few sentences slipped into the air, something shifted inside me. My name, Evelyn Hart, sounded different now, heavier, stronger. The reporter's microphone felt like a weapon and a lifeline all at once. I spoke about teamwork, transparency, and accountability. Simple words, but I knew the weight they carried. I wasn't exposing him yet, not fully, but the way his eyes darkened told me he felt it, the first crack forming in his glass empire. After the conference, the air between us was thick with tension. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His silence was colder than any scream could be. In the car ride back, his voice was low, clipped, almost surgical. "You embarrassed me," he said, staring straight ahead. "You don't speak unless I tell you to." I wanted to shrink back like I always did, but something in me had changed. I stared out the window, the city rushing by, and whispered so softly he almost didn't hear me. "Maybe it's time someone did." That night, sleep refused to come. My mind replayed every word I'd spoken, every look he gave me, every flash of the cameras. But beneath the fear was something else, an unfamiliar warmth. It wasn't pride, not yet, but it was close. I realized I had broken the first rule he ever gave me, and the world hadn't ended. The sky didn't fall, the earth kept spinning. Maybe my voice wasn't as powerless as he made me believe. Over the next few weeks, his demeanor changed. He became colder, more calculated. Tasks that once took a team were suddenly my responsibility. Deadlines were tightened. My workload doubled. It was his quiet punishment, his way of reminding me where I stood. But what he didn't know was that every late night, every forced smile was feeding a new kind of fire inside me. I started documenting everything, emails, conversations, data logs, not to destroy him, not yet, but to protect myself from the day I knew was coming. Then came the meeting that exposed his first real mistake. I was there, silent in the corner, taking notes as always. But when a senior board member questioned a report discrepancy, I saw it, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He brushed it off with his usual charm, but I knew the truth. I had seen those figures. I knew what he'd done. And for the first time, I didn't just feel trapped inside his lies. I held the key that could unravel them. That night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. For years, I'd seen a woman dimmed by fear. But this time, I saw something else. A spark, faint but fierce. "I told you to stay quiet," I whispered to myself. But maybe silence was never your destiny. As the city lights glowed outside my window, I opened a hidden folder on my laptop, the one I'd been building in secret. I typed the first line of a document I'd soon come to call the truth file. It was the beginning of something far bigger than I could imagine. Because cracks, once formed, don't stop spreading. The night I named the document the truth file, I didn't realize I was creating something that could destroy him or save me. It started small, just a few lines of notes, a handful of screenshots, and copies of emails he thought were buried deep in private servers. Every secret he'd hidden, every manipulation he'd crafted in the shadows had left a trace, and I was quietly collecting every piece of it. My name is Evelyn Hart, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I was documenting it. At first, I told myself it was just protection, a backup plan in case things got worse. But deep down, I knew I was preparing for war. I became invisible in plain sight. While he strutted across stages, giving speeches about ethics and leadership, I was at my desk, after hours, uncovering the numbers that didn't add up. Transactions routed through consultants, charity funds that disappeared, projects that existed only on paper. Each discovery made my hands shake, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of what I was holding. The more I found, the more I saw the man behind the mask. He wasn't just manipulative, he was corrupt. He'd built his empire on lies and stolen credit. He'd taken ideas from people like me, silent, hardworking, trusting, and used them to build his throne. But what he didn't realize was that he trained me better than he thought. I learned to read his patterns, anticipate his moves, and hide in the quiet spaces where he never looked. I started encrypting files, using names that would mean nothing to anyone but me. Project Echo, Red Glass, June Report, each one a puzzle piece leading to the truth. I bought a second hard drive, one I kept locked in a box under my bed. Every night, I'd back up my findings, my heart pounding at every click of the mouse. One mistake, one wrong move, and he'd know. He had eyes everywhere, and I was still under his command. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. Every morning, I walked into the office with a polite smile, holding coffee for the same man whose empire I was slowly dismantling. He'd greet me like always, "Good morning, Evelyn," and I'd return the gesture with the same calm tone, even as my mind raced with secrets he couldn't imagine. I had become fluent in silence, but this time it was on my terms. Then one evening, as I was preparing to leave, I saw him in his office, through the glass wall, arguing with someone on the phone, his voice sharp, desperate. I caught fragments of the conversation. "No one can find out. Clean it up. I'll handle her." The last word made my stomach twist. Her. Was he talking about me? My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. I just watched him. This man who'd built his empire on intimidation, now pacing like a trapped animal. For the first time, he looked afraid. That night, I backed up every file I had and stored a copy in a cloud account under a fake name. I didn't know what my next move would be, but I knew I had leverage. The balance of power had shifted, quietly, invisibly, like a tide turning beneath still water. And as I shut down my computer, I whispered to myself, "You told me to stay quiet, but now, silence is my weapon." What I didn't know then was that someone else had already noticed, someone who would soon reach out and change everything. It began with the message, short, anonymous, and terrifyingly specific. "We know what he's done. We need to talk." I stared at the screen for minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs. My name, Evelyn Hart, wasn't in it, but the implication was clear. Someone out there knew about the truth file. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. My hands trembled as I locked my laptop, glancing toward the window as though the city lights could offer safety. They didn't. Because if someone else knew, it meant the game had changed, and I wasn't the only player anymore. The message came from an encrypted email address. I didn't reply right away. Days passed, each one filled with paranoia. I checked for bugs in my office, hesitated before opening emails, and jumped every time the phone rang. He noticed my tension, of course. He always noticed everything. "You seem distracted lately," he said one morning, his voice dripping with that false concern I knew too well. "Is there something you want to tell me?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. I smiled back anyway. "Just tired," I said. But inside, I was wide awake and terrified. That night, I couldn't resist. I opened the email again. The sender claimed to be a journalist, an investigative reporter working on a piece about corporate fraud. They'd heard whispers about him, about the company, and wanted confirmation. "You've been close to him," the message said. "We believe you have what we need." For hours, I sat frozen in front of the screen. This could be a trap, his trap, or it could be the chance I had been waiting for. I weighed every possibility, every danger. Finally, I took a breath and replied with just 2 words. I'm listening. We arranged to meet in a small cafe on the edge of town. I chose the place carefully, somewhere public but quiet, where I could see every entrance and exit. The moment the reporter walked in, I recognized her from TV. She had a calm, unshakable presence, the kind that made people confess without realizing they were doing it. "Evelyn Hart?" she asked softly, and for a second I almost denied my own name. But then I nodded. We talked for hours. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to confirm she was real, that she wasn't working for him. She listened without judgment, her pen moving quickly as I described how he built his empire on stolen work and financial deceit. When I mentioned the files, her eyes sharpened. "You have proof?" she asked quietly. I nodded. Enough to bring him down. That was the first time I said it out loud, and it felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. But even as I spoke, a chill crept up my spine, because power doesn't crumble quietly. He would fight, he would threaten, and if he found out I'd talked. When I left the cafe, the night air was cool, but my pulse burned hot. The city seemed different, alive with possibility and danger. I looked over my shoulder more than once, half expecting his car to appear, his voice to slice through the quiet. But all I heard was the hum of traffic and the echo of my own footsteps. When I got home, I found another message waiting, from the same address. It read, "They're already asking questions at his board. Be ready." I stared at the words, my chest tightening. The walls of his empire were starting to crack faster than I'd planned. But that also meant one thing. He'd soon realize who'd been striking the blows. And when he did, I knew he wouldn't stay silent anymore. When I woke up the next morning, the city felt different. The air was thick with tension I couldn't name yet, but my phone told the story. Messages flooded in from colleagues, each one more cryptic than the last. "Did you see the news? He's furious. You should stay home today." My name is Evelyn Hart, and I had just become the center of a storm I didn't fully understand. The reporter's investigation had gone public sooner than I expected. The article didn't mention me directly, but the details were unmistakable. The company, the timeline, the corruption, the man behind it all. It was his face plastered across every news feed, every financial headline, every whispered conversation in the office hallways. And though I wasn't named, everyone who'd been paying attention knew I was close to him. Too close. By noon, his assistant called. "He wants to see you. Now." The voice on the other end sounded nervous, like she already knew this meeting wouldn't end well. I thought about refusing, but I knew that would only make things worse. So I straightened my blazer, steadied my hands, and walked into the lion's den. He was standing by the window when I entered, his reflection fractured by the glass. "Close the door," he said quietly. His tone wasn't angry yet. That was the worst part. He turned slowly, and for a moment, I saw not the powerful executive everyone admired, but a man cornered by his own lies. "You've been talking," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. I just met his eyes, and that silence, the same silence he once used to control me, was now my weapon. He laughed bitterly. "You think you can destroy me with your little notes, your files?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." But he was wrong. I knew exactly who I was dealing with, a man who thrived on fear, who silenced people not because they were weak, but because they had the truth. And now that truth was out there, spreading like wildfire. He threatened me, of course, promised lawsuits, ruin, blacklisting. He said no one would believe me once he fixed the narrative. I let him talk. Let him fill the room with his arrogance one last time. Then I said, softly, but clearly, "It's not my word against yours anymore. The files are safe, and they're not just with me." For the first time, I saw it. The crack in his composure. His eyes flickered, just for a second, and I knew I'd struck where it hurt most. He wasn't afraid of exposure. He was afraid of losing control. That night, I received another call from the reporter. "They've opened a formal investigation," she said. "Your files sealed it." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the urgency. "He's already trying to bury evidence. You need to protect yourself." I hung up and sat in the dark, my phone still glowing in my hand. The silence was deafening. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, echoing the storm I knew was coming. My life, my career, everything I'd built was about to be torn apart. But this time, it wouldn't be from his hands. It would be from mine. For years, he taught me to stay quiet. But now, the whole world was listening. And as lightning cracked across the sky, I realized something he never did. Truth doesn't whisper forever. Eventually, it roars. The next morning, I'd wake to find the story had gone viral, and my name would finally be in it. I never imagined my name, Evelyn Hart, would trend alongside his, but there it was, flashing across every news banner, whispered in every corner of the internet, the whistleblower behind the scandal. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Calls, texts, emails from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some congratulated me for my courage. Others accused me of betrayal. And then there were the ones that made my blood run cold. Messages that said things like, "You'll regret this," and "You don't know who you're dealing with." The morning after the story broke, I didn't even make it out of bed before a reporter camped outside my apartment door. Through the peephole, I saw the swarm. Cameras, microphones, questions shouted into the hallway. It was chaos. The kind of chaos he used to command, now turned against him. But I was still in the blast radius. I drew the curtains and stepped back into the shadows, my heart thudding. For years, I had wanted to be heard, but now that everyone was listening, it felt like standing under a spotlight I never asked for. Inside the company, everything was unraveling. Board members were resigning. Legal teams were scrambling. Investigators were circling like hawks. And he was nowhere to be seen. They said he'd left the city, maybe even the country. But his absence didn't feel like safety. It felt like a storm retreating to gather strength. The reporter, Clara, called that afternoon. Her tone was firm but kind. "You did the right thing, Evelyn, but it's not over yet. He's going to fight back." I didn't doubt her. I'd seen the way he operated. Charming one moment, ruthless the next. He didn't lose quietly, and he never forgot who made him bleed. That night, I went through my files one last time, double-checking that everything was safely backed up. Each document, each screenshot was more than evidence. It was a piece of my past, a record of every time he'd silenced me, manipulated me, made me doubt myself. I stared at the folder labeled The Truth File and realized something. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about reclaiming my story. When I finally stepped outside, the world seemed different. The same streets that once made me feel small now felt like witnesses. People looked at me with curiosity, some with admiration, others with quiet judgment. But for the first time, I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't hiding anymore. Then, as on cue, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A deep, calm voice spoke. "You think you've won." It was him. My chest tightened, but I stayed silent. "You've made powerful enemies, Evelyn, and you'll find that truth won't protect you." The line went dead before I could respond. For a long moment, I just stood there, the city buzzing around me. Fear tried to creep back in, but it couldn't, not this time. He wanted to scare me into silence again, to make me retreat into the shadows. But the thing about the truth is, once it's spoken, it can't be unheard. Later that night, Clara called again. They want an interview, live, national. They want to hear your story from you. I froze. The idea terrified me. But then I remembered that moment on stage, the first time a reporter asked me a question, and how it felt to finally speak. Maybe this was how I finished what I started. Maybe this was the moment silence finally shattered completely. I took a deep breath and said, "Tell them yes." Because if he wanted the world quiet again, he was about to learn what my voice really sounded like. The studio lights were brighter than I expected, hot, blinding, and utterly unforgiving. Cameras were positioned at every angle, microphones clipped to my collar, and producers buzzed around like restless bees. For a moment, I almost forgot how to breathe. The host's voice echoed across the room. "We're live in 5, 4, 3. I'd watched interviews like this my whole life, never realizing how heavy it felt to sit in the chair on the other side of the story. "My name is Evelyn Hart, and tonight I wasn't just telling my truth, I was reclaiming my silence." Clara stood just off camera, giving me a small, reassuring nod. I gripped the edge of the chair as the red light on the main camera blinked on. The host turned to me with that practiced warmth TV anchors master so well. "Evelyn," she began, "you were the closest person to him during the years this company rose to power. Tell us, when did you first realize something wasn't right?" The question hit me like a wave. For a split second, I saw flashes of my old life. Late nights in the office, the sound of his voice telling me to stay quiet, the weight of his shadow stretching over every part of my career. Then I exhaled and began to speak. At first, my voice trembled. I told them about the manipulation, the stolen ideas, the financial lies. But as I spoke, the fear started to fade. Every word I said felt like a stone lifted from my chest. The studio was silent except for my voice, echoing through the room with a conviction I didn't know I still had. The host asked follow-up questions, but after a while, it didn't feel like an interview anymore. It felt like a release. Years of silence unraveling, live on national television. Halfway through, the producer signaled to wrap up, but the host ignored it. She leaned closer and asked, "Evelyn, what made you finally speak out?" I paused. That question went deeper than the story. It reached into the heart of who I had become. I looked straight into the camera, feeling millions of unseen eyes watching me. "Because silence protects the wrong people," I said softly. He told me staying quiet was strength, but real strength is finally being heard. The words hung in the air like electricity. Even the crew stopped moving. And in that frozen moment, I realized something. The story was no longer his. It was mine. When the interview ended, the studio erupted into quiet applause. Clara ran to me, tears in her eyes, whispering, "You did it." I smiled, but deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the ignition. Because the moment the camera stopped rolling, my phone exploded with notifications. The clip was already going viral. People were calling me brave. Others called me a liar. Some offered book deals. Others sent threats. But through it all, I felt an unshakable calm. That night, I walked through the city alone, my reflection flickering in every shop window. The same streets that once made me feel invisible now shimmered with a quiet sense of victory. Yet as I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of a black car idling nearby, the same make and model he used to drive. The headlights flickered once before cooling away into the dark. For the first time in weeks, my heartbeat quickened with real fear. I wasn't sure if it was him, but I knew he'd seen the interview, and I knew he wouldn't let this go quietly. The next morning, Clara called again. Her voice was urgent. "Evelyn, something's happening. Someone leaked an internal memo from the company. They're accusing you of orchestrating the fraud." I froze. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting again. The war I thought I'd ended was far from over. Because when powerful men fall, they don't just crumble, they drag everything down with them. The morning the accusations hit, the headlines flipped overnight. Suddenly, I was the villain. My name, Evelyn Hart, was plastered across every news outlet again, but this time with words like fraud, traitor, and liar. The company's lawyers had released a statement claiming I'd acted alone, falsifying data to cover my mistakes. It was his final move, the desperate strike of a man watching his empire collapse and trying to pull me down with it. For a moment, I almost let the fear swallow me whole. The messages came fast and cruel. "You ruined everything. How much did they pay you to lie?" Even Clara sounded shaken when she called. "Evelyn, they've launched a counter-investigation. He's pushing hard. But listen, don't disappear. That's what he wants." Disappear. The word echoed in my mind. That's what silence always meant in his world. Disappear, be invisible, erase yourself to protect the powerful. But this time, I couldn't vanish. Not after everything. Not after finally finding my voice. So I did the one thing he never expected. I went back into the fire. I agreed to another interview, live again. The media didn't know what to make of it. Was I guilty, brave, or reckless? Cameras flashed as I walked into the studio, head held high despite the weight pressing on my chest. When the host asked me if the allegations were true, I didn't flinch. "No," I said, "and I can prove it." I handed over copies of documents, timestamp files, emails he thought were long deleted, evidence he could no longer deny. The interview aired that night, and within hours, the internet turned again. People saw the truth for what it was. His lies were unraveling, live, thread by thread, while the world watched. 2 days later, the authorities raided his office. Cameras caught everything: boxes of files, shredded documents, the very empire he built coming down brick by brick. I watched from my apartment, tears streaming down my face. Not from joy, but from exhaustion. Years of fear, gaslighting, and manipulation had led to this moment. The silence he'd forced on me became the sword that destroyed him. Weeks passed. The investigations concluded. He was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and coercion. His image, once polished and untouchable, was now reduced to a mugshot played on repeat. And me? I was free. Not in the way people imagine freedom. No parades, no victory speeches. Just peace. Quiet, honest peace. One evening, I stood by the same window I'd stared out of countless nights before, the city lights flickering below. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet, who believed silence was strength. She was gone now. In her place stood someone different. Someone who'd learned that sometimes breaking the silence is the loudest act of courage there is. A week later, I received an email from Clara. "They're honoring you," it read. "Journalist Association, Freedom of Speech Award. You should come." I smiled faintly, closing my laptop. I didn't need awards. My victory had already been written, in every word I finally dared to speak. Still, as I stepped outside that night, the air felt lighter. I looked up at the stars, clear, unfiltered, endless, and whispered to the darkness, "You told me to stay quiet. But you were never afraid of silence, were you? You were afraid of what I'd say once I broke it. The wind carried my words away, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel like a prison. It felt like peace. Because the truth is, I never wanted revenge. I wanted freedom. And now, finally, I had both.